Thank you everyone for joining us for the Book Brush podcast. Today I have Gail Nastasia on the show, and she's here to talk about her moving and touching memoir, The Fruit You'll Never See, and share a little bit with us about the inspiration from that, the healing journey, the growth, the depth. Thank you, Gail, so much for sharing with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, The Fruit You'll Never See is a memoir of your life, kind of getting to the point of recovery and healing. What happened in your childhood that was the core source of your need for healing and that initial trauma?
I think, well, to narrow it down, because there was a lot that happened in my childhood, I think I would have to say that it was my mother's addiction that caused the most problems for me, obviously for her as well. But I think that feeling of abandonment and separation and, lack of connectedness, because obviously a lot of, our foundation is built in our parents and, how that connection is between the parent and child. So I think because I lacked that made my life ripe for issues involving disconnection. And as I state in the book, a lot about shame. There was rampant shame, and I think for her as well.
Yeah.
So I think that that's probably what I would say is most prevalent in terms of that specific issue. But as you know, you read the book, there's a lot more. A lot came from that. So
yeah, it piles on. It's a snowball effect from there.
Absolutely.
Do you feel that, disconnection from your mother, that inability to really bond in the way that we all hope and want as a parent-child relationship, did that also cause disconnection from your deepest and truest self as well?
I'm very careful with my words, so I don't like to say it caused disconnection, but it caused me to feel disconnected, because I don't believe that I was ever truly disconnected, which is what the next book is about. But yes, in terms of feeling like I didn't fit, I didn't belong, there was something wrong with me. All of that, I think, was from that feeling of not being connected to my own self. There was something missing. Well, I thought there was something missing. Really, it was just that I was blocking myself off, and that's we talked about that, I think, at one point too. And again, that's the next this next book. But
so what was the impetus for you writing this story and sharing it? I think there are probably a lot of people who can relate to, even if not the specific things that have happened to you, but that feeling of abandonment and wound. But not everybody feels called, let's say, to share that story in such a public way. What was that decision like for you?
So I didn't set out to do that. That wasn't my intention initially. So somebody had passed away that was really important to me. That's in the book. And I was devastated. I was suicidal. I had been suicidal prior to that, but then I wasn't for a little while. So when he passed away, I didn't know what to do with that pain. So I started to write, and I typed. It was somebody had given me a word processor. Back then, we had the dot matrix printers. So I started to type, and I just kept going. I ended up with 150 pages. And I had started out with it was kind of cathartic. And then I decided I was going to write a book. I had this idea that I could do something creative, because I didn't know that I had any creativity in me, which is astounding to me today, but it's true. So the years went by, I put it away because I had other things going on. I had a couple of kids, and I was a single parent, and I was in law school, so I did all of that stuff. And then I finished law school. I started to practice. And then when I picked it back up again, I was in a different place, because I had gone through this whole process of becoming professional. I came from a place where we didn't have professional people in my family. We didn't have people who owned houses, people that I knew that we rented. We were on housing and had food stamps and that type of thing. So then I was in this whole other life. So then I had these two separate lives. I had the life where I was a poor person in addiction, or in the world of addiction. And then I was this professional person, but I was still in that world of addiction, so I,
Mm.
I was kind of like, I had a foot in both worlds type of thing.
Right.
So when I finally came to writing the book, to publishing the book, to really, deciding, making that choice, it came down to this issue of shame and being
Mm.
willing. And
Mm.
and I felt a responsibility at that point because I did have, and that became my calling, that became my drive, was
Mm-hmm.
to show people, and myself included, that I could have this history, I could go through this experience or these experiences, and that I wasn't less of a person. And
Mm-hmm.
that if I did show people who I really was, that I would
Right.
still be okay.
Yeah.
And that they could do that and still be okay. So that became my purpose, even though it didn't start out that way.
Right. Right. Do you mind sharing a little bit how you feel that being creative, expressing yourself through the written word, contributed to that healing journey and that willingness to, like, as that step along the road, to be, vulnerable, to open up, to show who you were and say, I'm not going to die if I'm true about who I am?
Right.
What was that
On the
like?
contrary, right?
Yeah.
Because being true to who I really am changed everything for me because I lived in shame my whole life.
Mm.
I had this belief, this feeling that if you knew who I really was, that you wouldn't like me. That you
Mm-hmm.
would, not only would you not like me, you would be disgusted by me.
Mm-hmm.
And so the writing process, it began as, just me telling the story, telling the stories, and then it morphed over time. And I mean, I said it was cathartic, but it was so much bigger than that because as
Yeah.
I began to shape the story that I wanted to tell, it became a whole different experience in terms of what I knew to be true. So,
Right.
like the people in the story, um, my aunt specifically, I got to see her in a different light. And I think
Mm.
I portrayed that as well. So, I went through my life having these different resentments and feelings of anger toward people. And, but I started to understand people in a different kind of way and in
Yeah.
turn understand myself, right?
Yeah.
Because even they have their own experience. My mother had her own experience. Well, everybody in my family had their own experiences. So I think I might have lost the question somewhere in there, but
Yeah, it gave you that opportunity to have those deep connections with people and see their perspectives and really encounter your own perspective and your own experience all at the same time, it sounds like.
absolutely. And it changed over time because
Yeah.
with every draft, with every new understanding about what I was writing about, it
Mm-hmm.
became clearer to me what the main
Mm.
issue was. This
Mm-hmm.
this feeling of shame because
Right.
it ran my life
Yeah.
for so many years.
So, what, in your opinion and from your perspective, is that connection between shame and addiction? Why are they so interconnected with each other?
I think addiction is a way to, well, so we did talk a little bit about this prior, that there were things that I do because I want to feel better, and shame
Yeah.
is one of those things that I want to feel better from, right? Because
Right.
shame doesn't feel good. So I
No, it does not.
it does not. So I would do things, and humans do. We all do.
Mm-hmm.
We do things that
Yeah.
make us feel better, or we think are going to make us feel better, and then they end
Right.
up making us feel worse inevitably. But that thing with addiction, whatever it is, whether it's drugs or alcohol or food or sex or,
Yeah.
whatever people use, like that, it feels better in some
Mm-hmm.
ways. At least it's not that feeling, that it's a
Yeah.
different feeling. And then, it compounds and it ends up feeling worse in the long
Yeah.
run. But I think that that's huge for people,
Mm-hmm.
especially people like me and my mother. I know my mother had, because my mother did get clean before she died. So there was some, we had an experience that was different from the active addiction one, but she had the shame. She had the
Yeah.
same thing that I did, and a lot of people, especially now that the book has come out, people have shame across
Yeah.
the board, even people who don't have addiction, but they have other
Right.
addictions. So
Yeah. So if you're sort of speaking to someone to whom this story might resonate, is it true that, just kind of dealing with whatever the addiction might be, alcohol, drugs, sex, food, whatever, it's really not the root cause? Like, you can get clean without dealing with the shame. And at some point, maybe that whatever your addiction of choice is, it just moves on to something else.
Right.
Is that true?
Absolutely. Well, and it's ironic that you say that because, and I did talk about this at some point another interview that I did. I got clean and sober in 2002. I didn't start to actually recover until
Yeah.
2010. I mean, I was still there's another experience that I had that will be in the next book where I actually thought about driving off the highway, and I was sober for 7.5 years. I was a lawyer, I had a house. Everything seemed to be good on the outside, but I was still the same person on the inside. I still had those same what I say ways of responding to the world that I had
Yeah.
always had. So
Yeah.
the shame, it took a long time. And then, obviously I didn't publish this book until 2023.
Yeah.
So all of that time, I still had those same feelings. I was still going into the
Yeah.
courtroom and knowing or believing that there was something wrong with me on the inside, but expressing who I was differently on the outside.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. There's the underlying pain, that underlying wound that's there, and until that gets healed, you either have to find, some way of coping with it. Could be unhealthy or healthy ways of coping with it, but we all are encountering stress and pain in this world, even if it's on much smaller scale. It doesn't have to necessarily be dramatic, but we can have healthy or unhealthy responses to that, and we have to do something with the pain. We can't just sit in it as human beings. And even when we sort of uncover maybe those crutches that are in our lives, well, now you're in the pain, feeling it all the time.
Absolutely. And I think that it's also incremental in the recovery process. It's just taking that one thing at a time. Like, okay, I'm not shame free all day, every day. Like sometimes I feel that moment of, oh my God, like this is, somebody's going to know this. Or if I meet somebody because it's happened, another lawyer, I'll be talking to them and they'll be like, oh yeah, I read your book. And then I have that moment of,
Yeah.
right, like, how did you
Yeah.
even know I wrote a book?
Yeah.
But it's apparently, people look up other people. I look up other people. I just didn't know that they would do that with me. But
Yeah.
anyway, so I have that moment, but then what do I do with it? Right.
Yeah.
So it's not that I am free all the time. And even with different addictions, it's not that I don't use something sometimes, but on a daily basis, what am I doing today? And is it blocking me off? Is it disconnecting me from, or making me feel disconnected from who I really am? So that same is true, for living in the shame as
Yeah.
learning how to live outside of it.
Yeah. I think when we hear stories like this of people who have gone through such painful and often very dramatic stories like yours, and you've gone, through like the shadow of death and come out the other side, and you've gotten the healing, people can respond in one of two ways, and one is to get more harsh and more hard, and one is to get more tender and more soft. How has it been being a lawyer, seeing criminals, working with criminals, but you bring to bear your own experiences of pain and suffering into that perspective and that relationship? How has that transformed the way that you work in criminal law?
Well, first, the criminal defense lawyer in me has to say people who've been accused of crimes, not
Yeah.
necessarily criminals.
Allegedly.
Exactly.
Allegedly everything.
Um, well, so working in that world I mean, that was my life. That was my childhood. I was a criminal. So, I mean, that was the way that I
Allegedly.
thought.
No.
No, I was.
Just kidding.
But that's the way that I thought. I had a criminal mind.
Yeah.
I thought, like, get them before they get you, and I was a thief. When I was a
Yeah.
child, that was my first drug of choice. I got arrested for stealing probably 5 times before I was 16. I was so I had that mentality of
Mm.
the world is out to get me, like,
Right.
and it kind of was in some ways, so I can understand it. So I understood the people that I work with in a way that I wouldn't have been able to understand them.
Mm-hmm.
And also, watching people, I was able to see that if I didn't feel that they should be ashamed of themselves,
Mm-hmm.
then, maybe I shouldn't be ashamed of myself either. Like I
Right.
had this, I wouldn't call it an epiphany because it happened over a
Mm-hmm.
really long period of time, but yeah, I think that, seeing other people in
Mm-hmm.
situations where, and I had a choice, I could either pretend that I was above them,
Mm-hmm.
and continue to live in secret, or, just admit and come out of the come out of the closet, so to speak, that
Right.
in certain circles we say we're just another bozo on the bus type of thing, and that's
Right.
so it brought me to a place where I'm no better than anybody and no less than at the
Exactly.
same time.
One of the ways that I like to phrase it to myself is, I am special just like everyone else.
Yep, I
And
like that.
both being able to honor the self but connect with humanity, I think is just, that's the most healthy place to be in that like dynamic between your relationship to self and others.
And it's like a constant thing, or it
Mm-hmm.
was when I was younger. Now it's, practice over time, but to be either better or less than, because
Mm-hmm.
if I was if I was better then I could be okay. If I was
Mm-hmm.
less then I just felt bad. So it was like this
Yeah.
constant struggle to be like, where in that hierarchy of humanity do I fit?
Right. Exactly. So um, I'm just so curious, as you're writing the book, was it painful to go back to those memories and kind of renegotiate them and even have that new perspective of, looking at your clients and and kind of being able to see yourself from the outside through seeing them from the outside? Was that a painful process to re-encounter those moments in your life?
Um, it's kind of an oxymoron, I guess I
Mm.
would use that word, because I was always in pain. So I
Mm.
wasn't going back to the memories.
Mm.
I mean, in a way, I was, because I was seeing them from different perspectives.
Yeah.
I mean, I was looking at them through a different lens, or I was trying to, which I think I achieved inevitably. But I felt those things every day.
Mm.
So there's in 12-step programs, there's the fourth step, which is kind of an inventory, an
Mm-hmm.
internal inventory. And people have a really hard time with that because they struggle with bringing that stuff up. I don't want to think
Mm.
about those things. I want to,
Right.
but the
I want to
truth
continue to
is,
shove it down. Yeah.
and the truth is that it's still there. And that's
Yeah.
the whole point. Like, we can't change something by keeping it in the dark. It has
Mm-hmm.
to be exposed to the light. That's what
Mm-hmm.
where freedom comes from, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
can't hide things and expect to be shame free.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, I mean, I had to go through it to get to the
Mm-hmm.
other side. There's
Yeah.
no way, there's no other way.
Yeah. Yeah. And so many things in life are like that. It's pay me now or pay me later, and
Right.
you can pick up sort of the sword and say, I'm going in, I'm going to fight my battle, or the monster's coming for you anyway, and you got to figure out how to survive unprepared. And so it's, what pain are you willing to pay, because the pain is coming anyway. Nobody gets out of this life for free. We're all,
Absolutely.
struggling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, that's where addiction comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I need to use things. I can't try to avoid feeling these things if I'm not using
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. So, was there an unexpected revelation that came out of the writing process for you?
Yes. That
Probably a thousand.
but the big one, the issue of shame.
Yeah.
That was the big one, because I knew that I had shame, but I thought it was just like
Mm-hmm.
anything else in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was just like fear or
Mm-hmm.
self-pity, or I thought it was the same, but it's so all encompassing. You know,
Yeah.
it pervaded every area of my life.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I couldn't function in the world
Yeah.
with it. Well, without, I mean, it was like, it was almost like my, my significant other. Although,
Yeah.
I mean,
Like
I
it's
didn't
like
want it
having
to
a
be.
toxic friend. It's like the only thing that you know how to use to drive you forward, but it's the only thing that's also holding you back.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally understand.
Yeah. So that was, and now, I mean, my life is just so different.
Mm,
It's so different.
yeah.
I can tell somebody something. I mean, I have no secrets. And this, it's a
Yeah.
huge thing for me because I can, I can go anywhere, I can do anything, and I have no secrets. There is
Mm,
nothing somebody could say or do that would change anything that happens in my life
hmm.
because I don't have any secrets.
Yeah.
So it's just a whole different experience.
Yeah. Instead of always being on that offensive, I'm going to get you before you can get me type of
Exactly.
way. It's just, you can exist, you can be.
Just
So,
be, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So many people who have trauma and who choose to transform that, into a book or a song or poem, painting, whatever that creative outlet is often a healing process for them. Would you recommend finding a creative outlet as a catharsis for people or as a healing process, or is it not really necessary, only do it if you feel like it? Like, where would you land in terms of that relationship between
I
creativity
would
and healing?
say absolutely. Yes.
Mm,
For me, like I said earlier, I didn't know that I was creative because
mm,
I wasn't really brought up. I didn't have people telling me that I was good at things or that
mm-hmm.
none of my talents were fostered. So
Right.
I didn't know, but I did, and I talk about this in the book too. I did learn how to knit and
Mm,
sew. And
yeah.
so there are things that I can do because I wanted to do things. I had a thirst for knowledge. And now that I've done this, I mean, I love to write. I didn't even know how much when I was
Yeah.
young. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I've done this, I feel like I can't even remember what it was like to not have a creative outlet. But
Mm-hmm.
then again, I mean, I was actively in addiction for most
Yeah.
of the time that I was. So, but yes, I would say absolutely whatever it is. And it's hard to imagine that there isn't something that
Mm-hmm.
somebody likes to do. There are so
Yeah.
many,
Could be cooking, gardening, pottery. I don't know. There's so many different things.
and all of that sounds good to me. I mean, I just love to do
Absolutely.
so maybe not
Yeah.
cooking. I'd rather eat than cook, but
Yeah.
so
Do
yes.
you do you feel that creativity is also connected to shame in the sense that, there's a very vulnerable way of expressing yourself and a very raw way of expressing yourself through those types of things, and that is again asking the light to come in, asking someone to see you as you are, and is shame kind of the dark side of that?
Absolutely, especially in publishing a book like this.
Mm-hmm.
When I see a review, well,
Mm-hmm.
actually, the reviews have all been good, but when I see a rating that's
Mm-hmm.
not good,
Mm-hmm.
if I see a 2-star rating or a 3-star rating, I get that pit in my stomach.
Right.
I feel that, and that's what that is, and I call
Mm-hmm.
it little Gail because
Mm-hmm.
because I feel it in a very specific, my chest, my stomach,
Yeah.
and my throat. That's where
Yeah.
little Gail lives. So when I feel
Mm-hmm.
something like that, I know that that's exactly what it is. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and for that moment, I have that they really know about me, like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
But then the second thought is, but I wanted them to, so
Yeah.
then so there's power in that too,
Mm-hmm.
because I get to choose, and that's where
Mm-hmm.
freedom comes in, right? I get to
Right.
choose that
Yeah.
you know the truth about me and how I feel
Mm-hmm.
about myself. And even in that,
Mm-hmm.
statement of seeing the ratings and having a feeling about that, because
Mm-hmm.
back then, if I had published a book, I would have said, I don't care what you think
Mm-hmm.
about me,
Mm-hmm.
even though that was what I cared about the most. You know,
Right.
like that was,
Yeah.
so it was even that, you know, that was,
Yeah.
it was shameful that I felt that way in my own
Yeah.
mind, not in reality. I think that
Yeah.
I think everybody feels that way.
I think so too. And, and it may come up in different beliefs. I know for me, when I have that the feeling, it's I did something wrong. And also, like you have said, it's sort of like then it gets turned into I am wrong. There's something wrong
Mhm.
with me fundamentally. Not I made a mistake, not oh, that book wasn't for them. It's I did something wrong becomes I am wrong. And being able to undo that and say, no, it's okay. I made a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. It wasn't that big of a deal. And I think also there's another layer too of saying, not only do I get to step into who I am and say, I get to represent myself on the world stage and you can like me or not, but also people get to misunderstand me and I have enough security to say, that's okay. You're allowed to have your opinion of me, even if I think it's mistaken or you don't really understand where I'm coming from.
Right.
How this is I'm super super curious about your answer to this question. Since you're writing a memoir, since you're telling the story of your life, how do you edit that? How do you identify what parts of that needs to be in the work for the work to be complete and whole, and how do you know what should doesn't really need to be in there, however true it might be?
Well, a developmental editor really helped with that. But there was this scene that I had from the very beginning. So when I started to write in 1980, no, 1994, that was when I started to write it.
Mm-hmm.
The scene was there. It was there the whole time. I kept changing, I mean, I didn't change the scene. I changed the way I wrote it because I
Right.
wasn't a writer back then. So did it in the first person and I started to really get into how, the layout of the scene um, and I wanted that scene in there so badly. Like I felt like it needed to be there. It showed a certain thing. And, because that's how I decided each thing that ended up in the book, each scene or each topic or whatever, it all relates to the main point, the arc, the thread that ties
Mm-hmm.
everything together. At least in my opinion, it does. And
Mm-hmm.
then finally, at the end of the editing process, I mean, the 25 edits or so that I went through because I'm also a perfectionist in that way. Um, I realized the scene didn't belong. And it was so painful for me because I really wanted it to fit, but each scene had to relate to this idea of overcoming shame and how I got there. And I wanted
Mm-hmm.
people to see, I didn't want to tell people this is how I wanted to show people, I wanted
Yeah.
people to see like, and I knew things because I was always intellectually bright.
Right.
I knew things. I wasn't stupid, but I was groomed in a way and not in a way. I mean, I was, I didn't finish that thought. I was groomed. And in a way, I was brought up, I was sheltered in this world. So I didn't have the experience of a lot of outside influence,
Mm-hmm.
especially back then when there was, now we have the internet. Now we see things that we didn't see before.
Yeah.
We have that experience of connecting with other people in that way. I didn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to show people. And so the specific scenes that I picked were
Mm-hmm.
very relevant to that end.
Mm-hmm.
This understanding of how the shame came to be and how I related to the world
Yeah.
and how that changed in the end.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I used that last scene in the courtroom because that was the beginning of this new leg, I guess, of my journey, which is again the next book. But yeah, I think that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we talk about grooming and it really trauma and these things, it's in part, taking away your right to authority over your own self. And when you say, like, oh, I was actually sheltered at the same time as you're being exposed to all of these horrible things, you're actually being sheltered and you're being sheltered from your own autonomy and your right to be yourself.
Right.
Uh, What is the experience now that the book is published and you have conversations with people like me, conversations like this, where you're returning to these stories and returning to these moments? Are there times where it's just like, you know what, I I don't want to talk. I don't want to be there. I don't want to talk about it again. Does it get tiresome? Is it keep you in the past? And how do you cope with kind of like being asked to return there?
No, I don't get tired of it. Um,
Good.
well, and my reason for that is, well, I don't live in the past. I
Mm,
don't stay there at all. I visit
yeah.
because I want people to see that this is across the board. We all have our own
Hmm.
experiences, whatever they may be.
Yeah.
I want to touch on the grooming issue for a moment,
Oh, sure.
not in terms of how it was for me, but in terms of how it was for the people who were around me, because I
Hmm.
don't believe that the people in my story, I mean, there
Hmm.
were some people who I mean, I don't make excuses for anybody, but there are some people that I'm not fans of generally. But as far as my family, my mother,
Hmm.
my aunt, and I think this comes across in the book too, I don't believe that it was intentional on their
Right.
part. I think that they were products of their own
Mm.
history and their own experiences. So
100%.
they
Yeah.
knew what they knew type of thing.
Yeah.
And so in terms of grooming, I think that when I use that word, I mean that it's how I grew up. It's how,
Hmm.
and I was taught what
The
they were
family
taught.
culture. Yeah.
Exactly, that pathology. So that's what I mean when I say that. I like to
Hmm.
be clear about that because
Hmm.
I don't blame them.
Hmm.
I don't have resentment. And that's
Hmm.
part of the reason, which, to answer the question, is I don't mind going back because I
Hmm.
don't feel that when I go back. I mean, I do therapy. Let me
Hmm.
be clear about that too, because I'm not 100% well. Like I don't feel like I've, overcome all of this stuff and I'm, good to go. I still have ways that I deal with things, in situations, and my responses to things aren't always what I wish they would be. And I know that
Yeah.
it's completely directly related to my history because it was my history, and those experiences are not, they weren't easy, when you learn how to
And
grow up a
they never
certain way.
become null and void. It's never that it
Exactly.
never happened. Yeah.
Right. And changing how you respond to the world that you've in a way that you've done your whole life, is not the easiest thing to do. It's a lot of
Mm.
effort. And it
Yeah.
takes a daily practice of doing that. So when I go back, I'm really just going back to explain how I got here and
Hmm.
how I continue to do this. So it's never in a negative way. It's never to
Mm.
ruminate or,
Mm.
to think, well, ruminate, I guess is the best word, because I
Yeah.
I have no desire to do that. But we really can't change if we don't know
Hmm.
what we do.
Yeah.
Dr. Phil says it. We can't change what we don't acknowledge. So
Yeah.
I have to go back there to see
Yeah.
how I started and what I do
Yeah.
in any situation.
What was your experience with the publication process? What were your expectations and assumptions going in, and what did you learn? Was it different from what you thought it would be?
I love this question. We talked about that too. Yes, it was a lot different because I thought I would be published. But so I went to Grub Street in Boston. I did the memoir incubator that was a year long, and I learned a lot about writing. That was in 2016. And then when I came out, I my teacher at the time had gone to Emerson, and they decided, well, I decided to apply to Emerson, and they wrote me a recommendation. And I went to Emerson and I thought, this is how it's supposed to be done. Now remember, I hadn't come to this conclusion about overcoming shame yet. I hadn't realized that that was what my book was about. I thought it was just
Mm.
about, you know, I don't know, becoming normal, I guess. I don't even know. I still don't know. Like anybody else, when you think about writing your story, it's like, I'm just going to write, how these things happened and here I am. Now I'm a lawyer, like that kind of, it was very basic. And then I went to Emerson, and that's how they do things in the literary world
Mhm.
is, you get an agent, you become published, you get a book deal, that stuff is how it's done. So it never even occurred to me. I didn't know. I mean, I knew that people self-published. I knew like self-published, that it was gross to me. It was like, just it felt like vanity. It felt like
Mm.
it didn't feel good because I didn't know.
Mhm.
I had
Mm.
this and I didn't learn these things in my education. I wasn't
Mhm.
taught that you could do this.
Mhm.
So I reached out. I had a couple of teachers at Emerson who were really, one introduced me to his agent. He's got a bunch of books out, and I know a lot of authors. So I reached out to them, and, I kind of networked, and I did reach out to some agents. I think maybe 12. I haven't counted officially, but the whole industry is, the gatekeeping industry is really set up to to fail pretty much. You hear people say, like, if you haven't gotten 100 rejections, then you're not a real writer. And I just
Right.
find that it gives me anxiety because
It's pretty grotesque.
it's grotesque, right? In my history of rejection,
Mhm.
given that so I had a friend who said back then, when I was looking for an agent, you're going to find somebody and they're going to have to be really strong and really brave, this your
Mhm.
agent or the
Mhm.
person who's going to publish this book,
Yeah.
because it's a story that people don't want to really get near. It's a
Right.
story that it's either, yeah, people don't, it doesn't feel good. I
Mhm.
mean, inevitably, I think it does. It has a happy
Yeah.
ending. But so when I decided finally to publish myself, she said, see, I told you it was going to have to be somebody who was strong and brave that was going to do it.
Yeah.
So I I started to investigate
Mhm.
finally. There was this one agent who kind of, a really big agent who kept me on the line for about a year and a half, and he kept saying,
Mhm.
and I wasn't done with the book. It
Mhm.
wasn't, obviously it was not near where it, because when I finished it, I published it. That's
Mhm.
how it worked out. But he just kept saying, all right, I'm looking at it, and then, send me this when you get it, whatever. And
Mhm.
finally, when he didn't respond,
Mhm.
and I just thought, why am I doing this to
Right.
myself? Why am I so I started to do research, and I learned that there were a whole bunch of different ways that I could go about it. And I mean, there are so many different options available, and I had to really research every single one of them, and which I did because I'm a researcher.
Mhm.
And I reached out to, well, Readsy is a big one for, publication purposes. So I found a lot of people there, and I was willing to pay people to do things that I
Mhm.
couldn't do, or that I wasn't
Yeah.
willing to learn how to do, like a cover, and,
Mhm.
that type of thing. And then I published it. And well, I also had a publicist, which I
Yeah.
think is really important too, because
Yeah.
there were things that I didn't know how to do.
Right.
Um, and I just feel such a sense of freedom about the
Yeah.
whole thing. I got to choose my own cover. I got to, create my own cover.
Which is
I got
beautiful, by
to,
the way.
thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. I love it.
I saw it when we first realized that we were going to be working together and doing this, and I was like, "Whoa, who made that cover? That's fantastic!" I literally
Yeah.
said that.
Vanessa Mendozzi is her name. She's fantastic. She's in the
Yeah,
UK. She's working on my
fantastic.
second one now, so that'll
Oh,
be,
good.
um and I went through this whole process, and then, it was just one thing after another of people reaching out to me and asking me, like, and I did get a couple of people who said, "Oh, who's your publisher?" And I said,
Mhm.
"Oh, I'm independently published." I don't like the term
Mhm.
self-published, because
Mhm.
I'm not self-published. It was a whole
No.
team of people who,
Yeah.
it was, I published independently, but there were a lot of people involved.
Of course.
Um, and then they make that face like, oh, like you're not a
Yeah.
real,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is funny because I see my
That's where
book
you
in,
started.
well, and I've sold a lot of
Yeah.
copies, and I've seen people who are traditionally published who haven't done that well.
Mhm.
So I know that it's not really about, it's
Yeah.
traditional publishing is really about exposure.
I want to ask you a couple questions about what you have just said, which is, kind of coming into the journey of independently publishing and initially having a negative reaction to it, and this idea of like, oh, self-publishing seems like very almost grandiose and like you're asking people to give you too much attention. Is that, I'm not using the same words that you said, so please feel free to
Same
rephrase
thing.
if that's not
That's all right.
quite accurate. How did you kind of get to the other side? Because there's two sides to it. It's the authoritarian institution that's saying, yes, little Gail, you've done a good job, you deserve recognition, and that desire, like you might even have for your mother figure a long time, saying, please just see me, please just accept me. And then there's this big institution, please just see me, please just accept me. Was there a parallel? Is that a true parallel? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, I think there absolutely is, and I think that's true for everybody,
Yeah.
right? Because if you think that I'm good enough, then I must be good enough.
Yeah. And if you think that I'm not, then I must not be. And devastation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we're just in a whole different arena.
Yeah.
It's not necessary anymore because we can publish. We
Mm-hmm.
can do all of these things without going through all of that trauma because it's
Yeah.
trauma.
It's trauma. And to, kind of have to, self-flagellate in front of, these authorities and say like, oh, do you like me yet? Are you going to accept me yet? Do you want
Right?
it yet? Is this good enough yet? All of those
Ugh.
things, it seems so similar to the same kind of trauma bond that you can get into with people. It's kind of
Exactly.
and even you saying like, well, ultimately I found freedom in independently publishing, the same feeling that occurred as you worked through the shame that you felt. So it just seems like such a parallel to me in that story, a little microcosm.
And I get to choose the people I work with.
In the same way, yeah, just like you get to choose your friends and then types of relationships
Exactly.
that you're going to have moving forward. It's a beautiful thing. I'm amazed by it. Thank you. So what's next? So you've mentioned a couple times, you've teased a couple times, another book is coming out. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Well, and I've mentioned it because I'm working on it day and night.
It's
So
top of mind.
it really is. It's constantly on my mind. So the next book, so The Fruit You'll Never See spans from, I mean, it starts in childhood and it spans to or through the end of this freedom from shame or this beginning of this freedom from shame. And again, it's not something I've overcome completely, but it's in progress. Um, and then, but in the Fruit You'll Never See, there's the end chapter of addiction, and then there's the beginning of or addiction to drugs. So getting clean, and then standing up in the courtroom. There's about 7 years in between those two points in time.
Wow.
So, all right, no, actually, it was finishing being admitted to the bar, which
Yeah.
was I had been clean for a couple of years at that point, or a few years, and then standing up in the courtroom. So there was probably about 7 years or 6 years in between. So this book is really, it is that 7 years or
Yeah.
that whatever period of time, and then a little bit afterwards. So it's really, so that book was about the trauma, and then the fact that I did go through this process and I did get clean. But then the next book is about how that happened. And really,
Yeah.
it's deeper
Yeah.
because I couldn't tell both stories at the same time. It was
It's too complex.
it really was.
Yeah.
So, what I will tell you is that in this book, I mean, in The Fruit You'll Never See, there were some scenes at the end of the book, and this is where the developmental editor came in really handy. There were scenes about my beginning to practice law. So I told you that I was in these two worlds. I had this one foot in like this underworld and then this
Yeah.
other foot in like above board, professional.
Yeah.
Um, and when I started to practice law, I was terrified, terrified the first time I went to jail, the first time I went to see somebody at the jail, because I had gone to see my boyfriend there many times. So I was afraid that they were going to connect me to that person that I was back then, that they were going to
Yeah.
look me up and be like, oh, you can't come here. You've been here as a visitor for, because I didn't know. I had no
Yeah.
idea. So those chapters, I think there were 3 chapters of that that transition. And I kept it a secret for a long time. I didn't tell anybody my history when I started practicing law, um, that I took out of that book. And now they're in this one because it's a whole different story. Because now this book is about changing the way that I respond to the world, changing
Mm-hmm.
how I go about my life on a
Mm-hmm.
daily basis as opposed to how I did back then, which was
It's
different.
yeah. It seems to me like that is really the kernel, the really deep story that's within the story. I'm really excited to see this book when it comes out. I'm really excited to
Thank
read
you.
it.
Me
Yeah.
too.
So, as a final question, as people who are maybe touched by the story that you've shared today and they want to read The Fruit You'll Never See, which actually, before I get into that, what does that title mean to you?
Oh God, that could be such a long, long conversation. Obviously, because you read it, that's a line from a poem my mother wrote. So
Yeah.
she says in the poem that the last line or the last two lines, it's true. She said, "I'll see no fruit, for I am deathly ill. I'm
Mm-hmm.
planting here this cherry tree for Chrissy, Gail, and Phil." So she was because
Mm-hmm.
she knew she was dying because she had AIDS,
Yeah.
and so when I was just driving down the highway when the title came to me, and it
Mm-hmm.
occurred to me, and this was at that time, that this is the fruit. She
Mm-hmm.
didn't see the fruit because she
Yeah.
died, shortly after. That was It was less than a year that she wrote that
Yeah.
poem that she died. It was maybe 8 months later or 7 months later.
Mm-hmm.
But the fruit is my freedom from
Yeah.
the shame, right? This is the
Mm-hmm.
the fruit that I get to see because
Mm-hmm.
she was who she was. She got clean for that period of time. And
Mm-hmm.
again, this could be a very long conversation, but when she died, there were, 200 people. We had a memorial. People came and people stood up and said, what, because she touched so many lives. She was a heroin
Mm-hmm.
addict my whole life. I was homeless.
Mm-hmm.
I was whatever, like all of these things, and she wasn't
Mm-hmm.
there. And then
Yeah.
for a year and a half before she died, she was present. She
Mm-hmm.
was she was clean. She was helping people, and that was who she really was.
Yeah.
That was the what was underneath all of that, like
Mm-hmm.
we talked about earlier, those addictions and fear and shame and all of that stuff. So yes, that's what it means to me. I am experiencing the fruit from the tree that she planted
Mm-hmm.
during that time.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. So now I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Where can people find you? Where can they find your book if they want to learn your story in depth and read your words? And looking forward to your next book coming out. Where can they find you?
It's available, I think, everywhere at this point where books are sold. The ebook is only available on Amazon for now, but it will be available soon in other places. My web address is probably the best, so it's gailnastasia.com, GailNastasia I'm sorry, .com. I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking my email. Um, and it's available in libraries too. And in the Northeast, a lot of the indie bookstores have it as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story, for sharing your
Thank you.
insights. It's a beautiful thing, and I really hope it touches other people. It's touched me, so thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.